Hey, welcome back to Dan's Chess Lounge, everyone. In round 4, we have Vladimir Kramnik facing off against Fabiano Caruana. Now, this is kind of like the old guard, Kramnik, going up against the new guard, Caruana. Kramnik was the sole leader going into the round. Yesterday was a rest day, so let's see how today the game would play out over the board. Kramnik was white. He played e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6. You have the Russian game, otherwise known as the Petrov defense. Black counterattacks the e pawn with his knight on f6. Knight takes pawn, d6, knight f3, and then knight takes pawn. Queen comes out to e2, attacks the pinned knight. Queen e7, knight c3, knight takes knight, pawn takes, queens come off the board, and you have an early endgame. It's only 8 moves deep, and the queens have already come off the board. This is one of the reasons why the Petrov is considered a solid opening, but kind of on the passive side, because you go into an early endgame. Knight c6, bishop e3, bishop e7. Players are just castling and developing their pieces, following good fundamentals and principles. Castles. Now you have opposite side castling right here. Normally, if the queens were on the board, then you could expect an all-out attack on each of the king sides. But with the queens not being on the board, you don't really the chances of a big kingside attack is slightly lowered. Rook he1. Kramnik is playing very fundamentally sound chess. He's developing his rooks to the open and semi-open files. He's developed all of his pieces by move 11. He's castled already. Very principled chess. Bishop f6. Knight d2. With the idea of coming to e4, attacking the bishop there on f6. Rook e8 stops that knight e4 plan temporarily. So Kramnik plays bishop f3, which renews that threat. Knight e5. Caruana attacks the bishop. Bishop f4. Now you have, if knight takes f3, if Fabi would have played knight takes f3, then you guys see what the devastating blow is? Rook takes e8. Checkmate. So obviously, he did not play that. Instead, he played king f8, which now renews that threat of playing knight takes f3. Now you have bishop d5. Caruana gets to hit the bishop with tempo, c6. The bishop drops back to b3. Now you have bishop f5. Black has finally developed his last piece. And h3. This gives the bishop an escape square, a flight square, in case the knight goes after it, or one of the pawns go after it. And it also could prepare a g4 pawn push, and in case white wants to storm the king side. And here you go. You have a g5 pawn push. It hits the bishop. The bishop retreats back to h2. King g7 tucks the king away nice and safely. c4. Kramnik wants to get rid of that double pawn. He would like for Fabi to have played d5 here, and then that way Kramnik could have exchanged off that double pawn. But instead, Fabi played g4, charge on. So with the queens off of the board here, the players can be more liberal, I guess you could say, and not as cautious with exposing their king. So that's why Fabi is going ahead and playing these pawn moves, which is right in front of his king Normally, when the queen is on the board, you wouldn't want to expose your king side like this. But he can play a little bit more fearless and more tenacious with the queens off of the board. Knight e4 hits the bishop. Bishop takes. Rook takes. Now you have bishop g5 check. King moves over to b1. G takes h. Now you have c5 from Kramnik here. Desperately trying to get rid of that c pawn. f5 hits the rook. Rook goes to b4. Threatening to take on b7 with check. You have h takes g. And then rook b7. King goes back to h8. Now, if we sit back for a minute and evaluate this position, who would you say is better at this point here? Black has this pawn on g2, which is very, very close to promoting, one square away from promotion. But on the flip side, Kramnik has a rook here occupying the 7th rank. That's great as well. Kramnik is getting ready to snag this pawn right here as well on d6. So, and then I just wanted to point out that Fabi is low on time. He only has 15 minutes to play the next 15 moves. So it's going to be a time scramble here. Who would you say is better? C takes d6. Now, knight f3. This hits the bishop on h2. And it also hits this promotion square on g1. So, what should Kramnik play here? How can Kramnik deal with this pawn that's getting ready to promote? He plays bishop a4. He figures that this pawn here is unstoppable. It's going to promote. So he's going to have to give up this rook here at some point, or give up this bishop here at some point for the pawn. So his idea in playing bishop a4 is that, well, hey, I'm going to grab some material on the queen side to try to make up for the material that I'm going to lose over here, either the rook or the bishop. So then Fabi plays knight takes bishop. Kramnik takes that pawn on c6. Now you have rook a d8. And this looks like a blunder because the bishop is hitting the rook here. So you're probably wondering, did Fabi just forget about his rook? No, it's tactics involved here, because if the bishop captures the rook here, that would be a blunder, because now you would have knight f1, and now you can't stop this pawn here from promoting. Even if the rook captures the knight, the pawn will just capture back and promote as well. So that would be a blunder. Can't do that. So he plays d7 instead. Hits the rook. The rook goes to e2. Now, just evaluate the position. Don't forget that white is down a bishop for one pawn. But white does have this monster pawn here on d7 that's very close to promotion. So now white's able to capture that that pawn on g2. The rook takes, and he goes back to c6 with the bishop. Knight g4, and then the rook snaps off that pawn on a7. So Kramnik, he got rid of another pawn, so now he has two pawns for the lost bishop that was taken on h2. Is that enough compensation? Two pawns for the bishop? Knight e3. Rook g1 hits the bishop here. Now you have h6, which is played in the game. But Fabiano missed an opportunity to increase his lead here in the game. And it's highly likely that the reason why he missed it is because he was so low in time. So if he would have found the correct move, which was rook takes c2 here, then that would lead to bishop a4, and then the rook goes over to f2, right? And he cannot capture the bishop here on g5 because then he would play rook f1, checkmate. So Fabi missed that continuation due to time trouble. Let's look and see if the bishop did not go to a4. If rook takes bishop was played, then you would have rook takes bishop, and then this would be a completely winning game for Fabi. So there was definitely winning chances there for him, but he missed it because of the time trouble. So instead he played, let's go back to the position. Instead he played h6 here to reinforce the bishop on g5. Rook c7 was played here, and that allows white to get ready to play rook c8. So at this point here, the game is still anyone's game here. Fabi missed his opportunities to really put a stranglehold on Kramnik. So now it's back to being anyone's game. This pawn here on d7 is a monster that's hard to deal with, especially now that the rook is right next to it side by side. So the king moves off of that back rank there, and he's going to try to march his way over to the pawn and try to be a more active piece instead of just being a passive king. He's going to be an active king. a4. So now Kramnik wants to roll his pawns. He wants to get his pawns rolling. So did Fabiano miss his opportunity to basically win early in the game before he even reached the time control? King f7, bishop b5, king e7. The king is just marching his way over. a5, Kramnik is pushing his pawn. Rook f4, getting ready to play a defensive role here. c3, king d6, and right here, Kramnik has an opportunity to get a winning game himself. So in the game, he played rook b7 right here because his rook was under attack by the king. But if he would have played rook c6 check, then let's see how this variation would have went. King e7. Now Kramnik would push his pawn. a6. The rook would have to take on d7, but that allows Kramnik to go to rook c8. Rook a7 is the only move here to stop the pawn. Then you have rook e8 check. King goes to f6, and then Kramnik snaps off the knight there on e3. So this would result in a winning game for Kramnik. His pawns would just roll. His pawns would roll. So he missed that opportunity. Let's go back. Instead, he played rook b7, rook g4, rook e1 hits the knight there, and Fabiano reinforces the knight with f4. This is move number 40. They both made their time control, and things can settle down, they can calm down, and they can really evaluate the positions and think about what's going on the board without being rushed. So Kramnik plays a6, and it's a pawn race. Who's going to reach the destination first? h5, a7. Kramnik has two pawns. That's only one square away from promotion. Rook a8. So now Rook B8 is being threatened by Kramnik. What would happen if he played Rook B8 right now? Well, let's see. Rook B8. Then you have Rook takes A7. Queen promotes. Bishop takes. Rook takes. And then at the end of this, you would have White gave up those two beautiful passed pawns on D7 and A7, all for Black's bishop. So that would not be a good continuation there. Let's go back and see what would happen if C4 was played. This was the best move in the position. Kramnik didn't play this in the game, but this was the best move. And the reason why is because after F3, the reason why is now C5 hits the king, king captures, but then you have Rook C1 check. King moves out the way, and now you have this devastating move, Rook C8. Attacking the rook here, and this pawn is going to promote. The rook is coming to B8. The pawn is going to capture the rook. If the rook takes, I mean, this is just lights out. It's game over. There's so many different ways here for White to win. I mean, it's just game over. So C4 was the winning move there. Kramnik did not play that though. Instead, he played B4. So he's got a little bit slower idea. He wants to basically move the bishop out the way and roll the pawns in a little bit slower fashion, but a more solid way, I guess you could say. So pushing the C pawn was definitely better though. That was just winning almost instantly. H4, C4, H3, it's a race. C5, both players are running with their pawns. King goes to E5, Rook B8, and this here was a blunder by Kramnik. He played Rook B8. So Fabi takes on A7, and now Rook G8 hits the bishop. But also, when the bishop moves out the way, it's going to hit the rook as well. So, let's see what happens here. Fabi plays bishop F6, which leaves his rook hanging. Kramnik promotes. The bishop captures the queen, and now the rook captures the rook. So at the end of that, Kramnik won a rook for the D pawn. So I ask you, who's winning now? I would say White is winning now. White is up in exchange. But on the flip side though, Fabi is only 2 squares away from promotion with this pawn and 3 squares away from promotion with this pawn. So his chances of converting one of those pawns into a queen is much higher than Kramnik's 2 pawns over here with the bishop still in the way. So we'll see. Let's see what transpired. Bishop F6. Is Fabiano trying to sneak a checkmate in on Vlad? That would be an awesome checkmate there if the king moves out the way to D5, and then Rook A1 checkmate. But you know Kramnik wouldn't fall for anything like that, would he? Rook G6. Now you have Rook B7. Hits the bishop. Bishop E2 here. Now Kramnik sticks the bishop on a diagonal that can cover these pawns in case these pawns get closer to promoting. But he's going to lose this pawn here. He's going to lose his B pawn. So he's no longer playing for a win. He's basically just trying to hold on and save a draw. Rook takes b4. King goes to a2. Knight c2. Rook hits the knight. And now the knight retreats to d4. Bishop d3. At this point here, both players are low on time. They're trying to make their second time control. Vladimir is even lower this time than Fabi. He only has a few minutes to get to move 60, and right now he's only on move 54. Rook a4, check. At this point here, when I looked at the engine gave 0.00. So it's a complete draw at this point here. So with correct play, Vlad could have saved this game, or Fabi could have saved this game. It's just a complete draw here, 0.00. But, you know, that's an engine, and it's a completely different story when you're a human being sitting there over the board without any help, and you're low on time, so you have to make the correct moves without even having enough time to think about it. It's a completely different story. King b1. This here is a bad move by Vlad. The king needed to go to b2 because then that would stop the knight here from jumping in to b3, threatening rook a1 check. But b2 looks scary. That looks like a scary spot for the king to go to because of this bishop right here. And you think that there's going to be some type of undiscovered checks once the king moves out the way. Oh, not there. Once the king moves out the way there, and the knight moves out the way, you would think there would be some type of undiscovered, some discovered checks. But b2 was a better square for the king to go to, because now that allowed knight b3, which hits the rook, and it threatens rook a1 check. And then rook e1 check. The king goes to d5. What happens if Vlad captures the bishop right now? If he captures the bishop, then you have rook a1 check, king b2, rook takes rook, and c6. h2, c7. The rook drops back to stop the pawn from promoting. White's rook goes to h6 to hit the h pawn. Rook c8, king takes b3, rook takes, and at the end of this variation here, this long variation, it's a drawn game. This is a draw right here because at some point the bishop is going to have to sack itself for this pawn right here. So, and then you're just going to be left with king and rook versus king and rook. So this is a draw here. But that wasn't what happened in the game. In the game, what happened was king c2. So Vlad was threatening to capture the knight on b3, and he was still threatening to capture the bishop here on f6. At this point here, Vladimir was really down on time. He was basically just playing off of the increment at this point. Knight d4 check. King goes back to b1. Knight f3 hits the rook. If the rook captures the bishop here on f6, then you would have knight takes. Now bishop f1 hits the pawn. Pawn goes to h2. Now rook h6. King takes c5. Rook takes h2. And this still looks a little promising for a black, but it's not decided yet. It's still unclear. Accurate moves still have to be played. The game is still in anyone's hands really at this point. It's not decided by any means at this point. Unfortunately, that wasn't what happened in the game. In the game, rook d1 was played here, which is a blunder by Kramnik, and it loses instantly. Because now, after that, you have rook A1 check. King C2. Now the rook grabs the rook. And let me just go back and stop right here. The reason why that's an instant loser for Kramnik is because there's not really anything that can stop the H-pawn now. I mean, because the knight and the bishop here are going to team up to block on this H4 square. So if white wants to stick his rook on H6 to try to grab the pawn, it's going to get blocked by whichever piece black decides to block with, and then the pawn is just going to march his way up the board for the last two squares. So that's why that was an instant loser. But with that said, there is still one trick left that Vladimir can try for and go for. And he tries to go for it. Let's see how it plays out. So they both made their time control on move 60 here, and they received 15 more minutes. But at this point here, the writing is on the wall for Vlad. But he tries it. Bishop A6. The idea is he can play bishop B7, check, and that skewers the knight. And then also, so he'll win the knight, and then that would also protect the queening square. But Fabi plays rook D2, check. King goes to C1, bishop B2, check. King B1, and then he snaps off that pawn on C5. So Fabi is too polished. He's too much of a professional to lose a game in this type of position here. So bishop B7, his last try. But then you have knight E5. Hits the rook, and it also covers this F3 square that the bishop here is covering. Now the knight is protecting it. So you have rook F6, and Fabi just goes ahead and plays F3 because you have this pawn here as well that's 2 squares away from promotion. Rook F5, F2 is played, and then Kramnik resigned here because he can't stop both pawns. One of the pawns is going to promote. He can't stop both of them. So with this game here, Caruana takes the lead in the tournament with 3 points. This was an awesome game. I really enjoyed it. It was very entertaining. Both players had many chances to win, and it was a back and forth seesaw type of a game. Those are usually the best games for a spectator and fan to watch, because you never knew who was going to win until the very end of the game. So, okay, guys, I hope you enjoyed that game. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you guys in round number 5.